My mom plunged a needle of hormones into my thigh at her celebration dinner, telling everyone she was starting my fertility treatments. When I begged her to stop, she rolled her eyes and said, "Sweetie, you're not getting any younger." I just stared at her. That was 3 months ago. Yesterday, she was led away in handcuffs screaming about ungrateful daughters. My mother is the most baby-obsessed psycho I've ever met. Starting when I was 8 years old, she made me and my sister Daniela wear these pregnancy simulation suits for hours every single day. 20 pounds of sand strapped to our stomachs while we practiced breathing exercises and watched birthing videos. If we complained about back pain, she'd add more weight and tell us real mothers don't whine. She even made us practice breastfeeding with these creepy little dolls that would cry if you didn't hold them right. While I spent every session plotting my escape, Daniela embraced it as if it was her one true purpose. She'd waddle around the house with perfect posture, rubbing her fake belly and talking to it out loud. By the time she turned 16, she was begging Mom to let her be a practice surrogate for her infertile work friends. And when she turned 18, Mom threw her a massive party, not for graduating high school, but for signing her first surrogacy contract. Everyone was calling her a blessing and an angel, while I sat in the corner feeling like I was at a livestock auction. Within 3 years, Daniela had carried 3 babies for 3 different couples. Each time she came home from the hospital, Mom would parade her around town like she'd won a Nobel Prize. Look at my generous daughter, giving the gift of life. Meanwhile, I was getting a biomedical degree, volunteering at women's shelters, and learning about bodily autonomy. But none of that mattered. Such a waste of a perfectly good uterus, Mom would tell anyone who'd listen. Her sister has blessed 3 families while this one hoards her fertility for herself. The most terrifying part was watching Daniela deteriorate. After her 4th pregnancy at 22, she could barely walk without pain. Her hips were destroyed, she had constant infections, and her hair was falling out in chunks. But when I tried to talk to her about it, she grabbed my hands with tears in her eyes. "Maria, this is what I was made for. My body is a vessel for miracles. Why can't you understand that?" That's when I knew she was gone. So I played along just enough to keep Mom off my back, told her I was considering pregnancy, wore looser clothes to family events, even Googled fertility clinics in front of her, all while secretly taking the LSAT and applying to law schools across the country, LOL. I specialized in reproductive rights and medical ethics, spending years helping women escape forced pregnancy situations. By 28, I was finally making a difference. So when Mom invited me to Daniela's celebration dinner, I figured it was just another pregnancy announcement. Boy, was I wrong. Turns out, it was an effing intervention. "Sweetie, you're not getting any younger," Mom announced while Daniela sat beside her, belly swollen with pregnancy number 5. "So I've taken the liberty of starting your fertility treatments." Before I could respond, she pulled out a syringe filled with hormones. "Just a little boost to get those eggs flowing." I jumped back, but Daniela grabbed my arms from behind. "Please, Maria, just try it. I've already found the perfect couple for your first baby." I screamed and fought, but Mom was already coming at me with a needle. That's when I noticed the other syringes on the table. They'd been planning this. As Mom plunged the needle into my thigh, I felt the cold liquid burn through my muscle. Within minutes, my vision blurred and my ovaries felt like they were on fire. Through the haze, I heard Mom on the phone. "Yes, we've started the protocol. She'll be ready for harvest in 2 weeks." That's when I realized this wasn't just about family pressure anymore. This was trafficking. I woke up in the ICU with ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome so severe they nearly had to remove everything. My mom stood towering over me. "We only brought you here because we wanted to save your womb," was the first thing she said. I pressed the red button for the nurse. She took one look at my mom and escorted her out to perform private examinations. As soon as we were alone, I felt even worse, because she wrapped her arms around me and asked if I was okay. I broke down crying, because the whole thing made me realize how terrible my mom actually was. I ended up opening up to her, and she seemed completely shocked by what I said, and asked me to repeat everything. The next hour consisted of me completely unloading everything: the surrogacy, the favoritism, the abuse. As soon as I was done crying, she called hospital security to ban my mother from my room, and I didn't know it at the time, but with the help of just one nurse, I was about to make my family pay, because when she came back with my medical files, her face was pale. "Your blood work shows something unusual," she whispered. "Those weren't fertility hormones your mother injected. They were experimental substances designed to trigger hyperovulation. You could have produced 50+ eggs at once." She showed me the toxicology report. "And there's more. Your sister Daniela, according to these DNA markers in your file, she's not your sister. She's your daughter, from when you were 14. They made you forget." My hands trembled as I stared at the DNA report. The nurse, Catherine, stood beside my bed with her hand on my shoulder. She'd risked her job pulling these files, and now we both knew why my mother had been so desperate to keep me away from medical professionals all these years. I tried to sit up, but the pain in my abdomen made me gasp. Catherine gently pushed me back down. She checked the monitors and adjusted my IV drip. The ovarian hyperstimulation had caused my ovaries to swell to the size of grapefruits. Every movement sent waves of agony through my body. Catherine pulled the curtain around my bed for privacy. She sat in the chair beside me and opened my medical file again. There were pages and pages of lab results, but one section was highlighted in yellow. She pointed to a series of numbers and dates. The timeline made my stomach turn. According to the DNA markers, Daniela had been born when I was barely 15, but I had no memory of being pregnant, no memory of giving birth, just a vague recollection of being sick for most of my freshman year of high school. My mother had told everyone I had mono. She'd kept me home for months, hiring a private tutor so I wouldn't fall behind. I remembered feeling tired all the time, my body aching, but the details were fuzzy. Now I understood why. Catherine showed me another page. The experimental substances in my system weren't just for hyperovulation. There were traces of memory-suppressing compounds, the kind used in clinical trials for PTSD patients. My mother had been drugging me for years. The door to my room burst open. My mother stood there with 2 security guards waving a piece of paper. She'd gotten a court order claiming I was mentally unstable and needed family supervision. The guards looked uncomfortable but moved toward my bed. Catherine stepped between them and me. She pulled out her phone and called the hospital administrator. Within minutes, the head of security arrived. He examined the court order and shook his head. The document was fake, printed on regular paper with forged signatures. My mother's face turned red. She lunged toward my bed, but the security guards grabbed her arms. As they dragged her out, she screamed about ungrateful daughters and wasted wombs. Daniela appeared in the doorway, her pregnant belly straining against her dress. She walked slowly into the room, one hand supporting her back. Catherine tensed beside me, ready to call security again, but Daniela just stood at the foot of my bed, tears streaming down her face. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. It was her, surrounded by 5 different babies, not her own children, but the ones she'd carried for others. Her eyes looked hollow in every picture. She scrolled to another image, this one of her medical records. 4 cesarean scars, chronic pelvic pain, kidney damage from repeated pregnancies. Then she showed me a bank statement. Our mother had been taking 90% of her surrogacy fees. Daniela had been living on the remaining 10%, barely enough to cover her medical expenses. She'd been trapped in a cycle of pregnancy and poverty for years. Catherine examined Daniela's phone, her expression growing more horrified with each document. She made copies of everything on the hospital printer. The evidence was overwhelming. Our mother had been running a reproductive trafficking ring using her own daughters. Daniela sank into the chair Catherine had vacated. She rubbed her swollen belly and winced. This pregnancy was different, she explained. The couple who'd hired her had backed out after learning about her deteriorating health, but our mother had forced her to continue anyway, planning to sell the baby on the black market. I reached for Daniela's hand. For the first time in years, she didn't pull away. We sat in silence, 2 sisters who were actually mother and daughter, both victims of the same woman who should have protected us. Catherine returned with more documents. She'd been digging through hospital records and found something disturbing. Over the past decade, our mother had brought in 6 other young women with similar symptoms. All had been treated for ovarian hyperstimulation. All had listed my mother as their emergency contact. The pattern was clear. Our mother had been expanding her operation, targeting vulnerable women and forcing them into surrogacy. The experimental substances she used caused rapid egg production, but also severe complications. Several of the women had nearly died. A knock on the door made us all jump. A man in a suit entered, introducing himself as the hospital's legal counsel. He'd been briefed on the situation and wanted to help, but he warned us that without proper evidence, it would be difficult to stop my mother permanently. That's when I remembered my legal training. I might have been drugged and traumatized, but I still had my law degree. I asked Catherine for a pen and paper. Despite the pain medication making my thoughts fuzzy, I began outlining a strategy. We needed to document everything. Medical records, bank statements, witness testimonies. Catherine had already started the process, but we needed more. I sent her to retrieve my laptop from my apartment. My years of working with reproductive rights organizations had taught me exactly what evidence we'd need. Daniela watched me work, her hand resting on her belly. She asked about the baby she was carrying. What would happen to it now? The thought of another child being sold made me sick. I promised her we'd figure something out. Catherine returned with my laptop and my work files. I'd kept detailed notes on every case I'd worked on, every woman I'd helped escape forced pregnancy situations. Now I was using that knowledge to save myself and my daughter. The hospital administrator arrived with a social worker. They'd been investigating my mother's connection to the other women who'd been treated here. Several had come forward with similar stories of coercion and drugging. The case was bigger than just our family, but I knew my mother wouldn't give up easily. She had connections, money from years of selling babies and surrogacy fees. She'd already tried to forge court documents. What else was she capable of? As if reading my thoughts, Catherine's phone buzzed. Security had caught my mother trying to sneak back into the hospital through the emergency room. She'd been carrying a bag full of syringes and unmarked vials. They'd detained her and called the police. The social worker began making calls. Daniela needed immediate protection and medical care. The baby she was carrying would need to be placed safely once born. There were protocols for these situations, but they would take time to implement. I closed my eyes, exhausted from the pain and revelations. In one day, I discovered I had a daughter, uncovered a trafficking ring, and nearly lost my reproductive organs to experimental substances. But I was alive, and for the first time in my life, I had people who believed me. Catherine squeezed my hand. She promised to stay with me through the night. The security guards would remain posted outside my door. Tomorrow, we'd begin the long process of building a legal case, but tonight, I just needed to heal. Daniela curled up in the reclining chair beside my bed. Despite everything, she was still my little girl, the daughter I never knew I had. We had years of lies to unravel and trauma to process, but we were together now, and our mother couldn't hurt us anymore. As the pain medication pulled me towards sleep, I thought about all the women my mother might have victimized, all the babies sold, all the bodies destroyed for profit. Tomorrow, I'd use every legal tool at my disposal to stop her. But tonight, I just held my daughter's hand and let myself grieve for the childhood she never had and the mother I never got to be. The pain medication made everything feel distant, but I forced myself to stay alert. Catherine had positioned herself between my bed and the door, checking her phone every few minutes for updates from security. Daniela shifted uncomfortably in her chair, one hand pressed against her lower back while the other rubbed circles on her swollen belly. I studied my daughter's face in the harsh hospital lighting. Now that I knew the truth, I could see traces of myself in her features. The same stubborn chin, the same way her eyebrows pulled together when she was thinking. How had I missed it for so many years? Catherine's phone vibrated again. She read the message and her shoulders relaxed slightly. Security had moved my mother to a holding area in the basement while they waited for police to arrive. The bag of syringes had been cataloged as evidence. For now, we were safe, but I knew my mother too well. She'd spent decades perfecting her manipulation tactics. A few security guards and a locked door wouldn't stop her for long. I needed to work fast while she was contained. I opened my laptop and began creating a timeline. Every memory I could dredge up from my freshman year of high school. The sudden illness that kept me home. The private tutor who only came 3 days a week. The way my clothes had gotten tighter around my middle, which my mother had blamed on bloating from the medication. Daniela watched me type. Her breathing labored from the weight of her pregnancy. She pulled out a small notebook from her purse and handed it to me. Inside were dates, names, and dollar amounts. A record of every surrogacy arrangement, every payment, every medical procedure. Catherine leaned over to examine the notebook. Her face grew pale as she traced her finger down the columns of numbers. The amounts were staggering. My mother had collected over $500,000 from Daniela's pregnancies alone, and that didn't include whatever she'd made from the other women. The social worker returned with a stack of forms. She explained that Daniela could be placed in a women's shelter immediately, somewhere our mother wouldn't find her. They had medical staff who could monitor her pregnancy and ensure the baby's safety. But Daniela shook her head, gripping my hand tighter. She wasn't ready to leave yet. There were things she needed to tell me first. Things our mother had made her promise never to reveal. She'd been carrying these secrets for years, and the weight of of them was crushing her. Catherine excused herself to check on my test results. The social worker stepped outside to make more calls. Finally, it was just me and my daughter, alone for the first time since I'd learned the truth. Daniela struggled to stand, then moved to sit on the edge of my bed. She placed my hand on her belly, and I felt the baby kick. The life growing inside her was innocent in all of this, another victim of our mother's schemes. She began to tell me about the other girls, young women our mother had mentored through her volunteer work at the fertility clinic, vulnerable teenagers from broken homes, desperate for a mother figure. Our mother would take them in, shower them with affection, then slowly introduce the idea of surrogacy as a way to give back to the world. The grooming process was always the same. First came the pregnancy simulation suits, just like she'd done with us, then the hormone treatments to regulate their cycles. By the time they realized what was happening, they were already pregnant and financially dependent on our mother. Some of the girls had tried to run. Daniela had seen what happened to them. Our mother would track them down, threaten to report them for breach of contract, remind them that they had no money and nowhere to go. Most came back within days. I typed frantically, documenting every detail. My legal training kicked in as I organized the information into categories: coercion, fraud, human trafficking. The case against our mother was building with every revelation. Catherine returned with my latest blood work. The experimental substances were slowly leaving my system, but the damage to my ovaries was severe. She'd consulted with the head of gynecology, who recommended immediate treatment to prevent permanent infertility. But there was a problem. The treatment required specific medications that weren't typically stocked in the hospital pharmacy. They'd need to be special ordered, which could take days. And with my mother still technically listed as my emergency contact in some systems, there was a risk she'd be notified of the prescription. I made a decision. We'd wait. My ovaries could handle a few more days of swelling if it meant keeping our mother in the dark. Catherine disagreed, warning me about the risks of organ failure, but I knew my mother's patterns. The moment she learned about my condition, she'd find a way to exploit it. The social worker knocked and entered with 2 police officers. They needed our statements about the assault and the forged court documents. I walked them through the events at the dinner, showed them the injection site on my thigh, explained about the experimental substances. Daniela added her testimony about the forced surrogacies and financial exploitation. She showed them her notebook, the bank statements on her phone, photos of her medical records. The officers took notes, their expressions growing more serious with each detail. One of them mentioned that they'd found more syringes in my mother's car, different substances this time, including sedatives and memory suppressants. She'd been prepared for resistance. The thought made my skin crawl. After the officers left, exhaustion hit me like a wave. The adrenaline that had kept me focused was wearing off, replaced by deep bone-aching fatigue. Catherine adjusted my pain medication and suggested I rest, but sleep felt dangerous. What if my mother found a way past security? What if she got to Daniela? I forced myself to stay awake, working on my laptop while Daniela dozed in the chair. I researched the experimental substances in my system, cross-referencing them with clinical trials and FDA warnings. What I found made my stomach turn. The substances were part of a discontinued study from 5 years ago. The trial had been shut down after several participants developed severe complications, including organ failure and permanent infertility. How my mother had gotten access to them was a mystery, but I had my suspicions about her connections at the fertility clinic. Catherine's shift was ending, but she refused to leave. She'd already called in sick for her next shift, determined to see this through. She brought us food from the cafeteria, made sure Daniela had extra pillows for her back, and kept checking the security feeds on her phone. Around midnight, Daniela woke with a gasp. She was having contractions. Catherine immediately called for the obstetrics team while I held my daughter's hand. The baby wasn't due for another month, but the stress of the day had triggered early labor. They wheeled Daniela away for evaluation while I struggled to follow, still hooked to my IV pole. Catherine steadied me as we made our way to the maternity ward. The contractions were false labor, they determined, but Daniela needed to be monitored closely. We spent the rest of the night in the maternity ward, me in a wheelchair beside Daniela's bed. She told me more stories about her pregnancies, about the couples who'd hired her, about how our mother had stage managed every interaction to maximize profit. The worst part was learning about my own pregnancy. Daniela had found our mother's journals years ago, hidden in the attic. Detailed notes about my condition, the substances used to suppress my memories, the adoption arrangement she'd orchestrated. She'd kept me unconscious for the delivery, told everyone I'd had a severe reaction to antibiotics. I'd given birth to my own daughter and never knew it. Never held her, never fed her, never got to be her mother. The grief hit me in waves, each one threatening to pull me under. Catherine brought me tissues while I sobbed, years of stolen motherhood pouring out in tears. Dawn broke through the hospital windows. Catherine's phone buzzed with an update. My mother had been formally arrested and charged with assault, fraud, and false imprisonment. She was being held without bail pending a psychiatric evaluation. For the first time in my life, she couldn't reach us. The relief was overwhelming but temporary. I knew she had lawyers, connections, ways to manipulate the system. We needed to act fast while she was contained. I sent emails to my contacts in the reproductive rights community, alerting them to the situation. Within hours, offers of help poured in. A colleague from the women's shelter offered to take Daniela in immediately. Another provided contact information for a prosecutor who specialized in trafficking cases. A third connected us with a journalist who'd been investigating illegal surrogacy rings for years, but I was careful not to overreach. This needed to stay focused on our family's situation, not become some massive investigation. I'd seen too many cases fall apart when they got too big, too public. We needed surgical precision, not a sledgehammer. Catherine finally convinced me to sleep for a few hours. She promised to wake me if anything changed. I drifted off, still holding Daniela's hand, my daughter and I together in a way we'd never been allowed before. I woke to commotion in the hallway. Catherine was arguing with someone, her voice firm but professional. I recognized the other voice immediately. My mother's sister, my Aunt Patricia, demanding to see us. Patricia had always been my mother's enabler, making excuses for her behavior, funding her schemes when money got tight. She stood in the doorway now, designer purse clutched to her chest, insisting that this was all a misunderstanding. Catherine held her ground, but Patricia was persistent. She claimed to have power of attorney, waved documents that looked official. Security arrived to mediate, and I could see them wavering. Patricia was well-dressed, well-spoken, the picture of concerned family. I struggled out of bed, ignoring the pain in my abdomen. Using my fourth hole for support, I confronted my aunt directly. I showed her the bruise on my thigh from the injection, the medical report reports documenting the experimental substances, the evidence of what her sister had done. Patricia's mask slipped for just a moment. She knew. She'd always known. But admitting it would mean acknowledging her own complicity, her own failure to protect us. Instead, she doubled down, insisting that I was confused, that the substances had affected my judgment. The social worker arrived and took control of the situation. She examined Patricia's documents and found them to be outdated from before I turned 18. There was no power of attorney, no legal standing. Patricia was escorted out, but not before promising that the family would handle this privately. I knew what that meant. Phone calls to lawyers, pressure on witnesses, attempts to discredit our story. The family machine was mobilizing to protect its reputation, but they'd underestimated us. We had evidence, medical documentation, and most importantly, we had each other. Daniela's contractions started again that afternoon, stronger this time. The baby was coming whether we were ready or not. As they prepared her for delivery, she gripped my hand with surprising strength. She was terrified, not of the birth itself, but of what came after. Who would take the baby? What would happen to her? I promised her that we'd figure it out together, that she didn't have to give up another child unless she wanted to, that for the first time in her life she had a choice. The relief in her eyes broke my heart all over again. The delivery was complicated. Years of pregnancies had taken their toll on Daniela's body. Catherine stayed with us, advocating for pain management and comfort measures that the obstetrics team might have overlooked. I held my daughter's hand through every contraction, whispered encouragement when she wanted to give up. 6 hours later, a baby girl was born, tiny but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and powerful lungs. The nurse placed her on Daniela's chest, and I watched my daughter become a mother. The cycle our mother had tried to control had broken. This child would know love, not manipulation. But our relief was short-lived. A man appeared in the doorway, expensive suit and briefcase marking him as a lawyer. He represented the couple who'd originally hired Daniela for this surrogacy. They wanted their baby, contract or no contract. I stepped between him and Daniela's bed, summoning every bit of legal knowledge I possessed. The contract had been signed under duress. Daniela had been financially coerced. The experimental substances in my system proved a pattern of abuse that invalidated any agreement. The lawyer wasn't impressed. He'd seen desperate birth mothers before, he said. They always claimed coercion when they changed their minds. He pulled out his phone to call his clients, promising that this would get ugly if we didn't cooperate. Catherine intervened, reminding him that he was in a hospital, not a courtroom. Security was called once again. The lawyer left, but his threat lingered. We'd won this round, but the legal battles were just beginning. The pediatric team took the baby for standard newborn tests while Daniela recovered. I used the time to strengthen our position. More emails to colleagues, more documentation gathered, more evidence compiled. My laptop became command central for our defense. That evening, my mother made her move. Not in person, but through the system she'd manipulated for years. A social services inspector arrived, claiming to have received reports of an unsafe environment for a newborn. She wanted to evaluate Daniela's fitness as a mother. The inspection was thorough and humiliating. Questions about Daniela's mental state, her financial situation, her living arrangements. The inspector took notes on everything, from the IV in Daniela's arm to the security guards outside our door. She photographed the room, documented the medical equipment, interviewed the nurses. I knew this tactic. Create enough doubt about a mother's fitness, and the state could intervene. My mother was trying to take the baby through official channels since her direct approach had failed, but we were ready for her. Catherine had been documenting everything with equal thoroughness. Every medical decision, every interaction, every moment of Daniela's care for her baby. The nurses on the ward rallied around us, providing statements about Daniela's attentiveness and capability as a new mother. The inspector left without making any immediate decisions. She'd file her report, she said, and child services would determine next steps. The threat hung over us like a storm cloud. Even from jail, our mother was pulling strings. That night, I made a decision. We couldn't keep playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. I opened my laptop and began drafting a comprehensive report of our mother's activities, not for the police or prosecutors, but for the medical board that oversaw the fertility clinic where she volunteered. The report detailed everything: the experimental substances, the forced pregnancies, the financial exploitation. I attached Daniela's records, the bank statements, photos of my injection site. Years of legal work had taught me how to build an airtight case. Catherine reviewed the report, adding her own professional observations about the medical violations she'd witnessed. She'd risked her career to help us, and I'd never forget that. Together, we crafted a document that would end our mother's access to vulnerable women forever. I sent the report just as the sun rose on our third day in the hospital. My ovaries were slowly returning to normal size, the pain finally manageable without heavy medication. Daniela was learning to breastfeed her daughter, the two of them bonding in ways she'd never been allowed with her previous babies. We'd survived the immediate crisis, but I knew the war wasn't over. Our mother had resources, connections, and decades of experience manipulating systems. She'd regroup, find new angles of attack, try to regain control, but something had fundamentally shifted. For the first time in our lives, Daniela and I were fighting back together, mother and daughter, united against the woman who'd tried to use our bodies for profit. We had truth on our side, evidence to support us, and people who believed our story. The baby stirred in Daniela's arms, making soft newborn sounds. My granddaughter, though the generational lines were so twisted it made my head spin. Another innocent life that our mother had tried to commodify. But not this time. This child would grow up free. Catherine's shift was starting again. She'd barely slept in 3 days, but she refused to leave us unprotected. She brought fresh coffee and updates from security. Our mother remained in custody, her bail hearing scheduled for the following week. We had time to prepare. I closed my laptop and looked at my daughter, my granddaughter, my chosen family of survivors. We'd been broken and manipulated, drugged and exploited, but we were still here, still fighting, still refusing to be reduced to walking wombs for profit. The road ahead would be difficult. Legal battles, family drama, the long process of healing from trauma. But for the first time since I was 14 years old, I felt like I could breathe. The truth was out, the secrets were exposed, and we were free. The next morning brought chaos. Catherine rushed into my room, her face flushed from running. My mother had posted bail through a bondsman Patricia had hired. She was already on her way to the hospital with a team of lawyers and what Catherine described as medical professionals she'd hired privately. I grabbed my laptop and started backing up everything to multiple cloud services. My hands shook as I uploaded file after file. Daniela clutched her baby tighter, her eyes wide with panic. Catherine Catherine made rapid phone calls trying to get security reinforcements. 20 minutes later, my mother swept into the room flanked by 3 men in suits and 2 women in white coats. She looked composed, professional, nothing like the woman who'd been dragged out screaming days earlier. Her transformation was calculated to impress any authorities who might intervene. The lead lawyer presented documents claiming I was suffering from substance-induced psychosis and needed immediate psychiatric evaluation. The women in white coats nodded along, clipboards ready. My mother stood behind them, her expression one of maternal concern that made my skin crawl. I recognized the strategy immediately. Paint me as unstable, use the experimental substances in my system as evidence of mental impairment, then gain control through medical guardianship. But I'd spent years studying these tactics. I knew how to counter them. Catherine stepped forward, blocking their approach to my bed. She calmly explained that any psychiatric evaluation would need to go through proper hospital channels. The hired doctors had no privileges here. The lawyers could submit their requests through appropriate legal channels. One of the lawyers pulled out his phone and started recording, claiming Catherine was obstructing necessary medical care. My mother began crying on cue, wailing about her poor, delusional daughter who needed help. The performance was Oscar-worthy. I used the distraction to send a rapid series of emails to my contacts. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing with responses. A colleague from the women's shelter was already in the hospital visiting another client. She'd be up in 5 minutes. Another contact at legal aid was dispatching someone immediately. The hospital administrator arrived, drawn by the commotion. He took one look at the scene and called for additional security. The hired doctors were escorted out first, their lack of hospital credentials making them easy to remove. The lawyers protested but followed when threatened with trespassing charges. My mother refused to leave. She planted herself in a chair, claiming her right as a parent to be present. The administrator explained that I was an adult and had explicitly banned her from my room. She'd need to leave voluntarily or be removed. That's when she played her final card. She pulled out a folder of photographs, pictures of me from high school, clearly pregnant though I had no memory of it, medical records she'd somehow preserved, documentation of the adoption she'd arranged without my knowledge or consent. She spread them across my bed, each image a piece of my stolen history. Catherine gathered them quickly, but not before I'd seen enough. My younger self, drugged and confused, belly swollen with a baby who would become Daniela. The truth laid bare in glossy prints. My colleague from the women's shelter arrived just as security was moving to physically remove my mother. She was a former prosecutor who knew exactly how to handle the situation. She examined the photos my mother had brought, recognizing them immediately as evidence of crimes rather than leverage. The hospital administrator made the decision to involve law enforcement again. My mother's bail conditions had included staying away from the hospital. By showing up with fraudulent medical professionals and attempting to force a psychiatric evaluation, she'd violated those conditions. Police arrived within the hour. This time, my mother didn't go quietly. She screamed about her rights, about the conspiracy against her, about ungrateful daughters who didn't understand sacrifice. The officers had to physically carry her out while she thrashed and cursed. Patricia appeared in the hallway as they were leaving, trying to intervene. She'd brought more lawyers, these ones claiming to represent Daniela's interests. They wanted to discuss the baby's placement, suggesting that Patricia would be a suitable guardian given Daniela's fragile mental state. Daniela surprised everyone by standing up, still weak from delivery but fierce in her determination. She walked to the doorway, baby in her arms, and faced Patricia directly. For the first time in her life, she refused to be manipulated. She shook her head firmly and turned her back on her aunt. The legal aid attorney arrived and immediately went to work. She reviewed all our documentation, interviewed Catherine about what she'd witnessed, and began preparing restraining orders, not just against my mother, but against Patricia and any other family members who might try to intervene. That afternoon, we learned my mother had been reaching out to the couples who'd hired Daniela for previous surrogacies. She was trying to convince them that Daniela had stolen their biological children, hoping to create enough legal chaos to regain control. Several couples had already contacted lawyers. I spent hours on the phone with my contacts in reproductive law, building a defensive network. Each couple would need to be contacted individually, shown the evidence of coercion and trafficking. It was exhausting work, but necessary to prevent my mother from weaponizing Daniela's past against her. Catherine's supervisor arrived for a meeting. There had been complaints about Catherine's unprofessional involvement in a patient's personal affairs. My mother had filed them before her arrest, but they still needed to be addressed. Catherine faced potential disciplinary action for helping us. I provided a detailed written statement about Catherine's actions, emphasizing how she'd followed proper protocols while protecting a patient from abuse. The other nurses on the ward added their own statements. Even the hospital administrator weighed in, praising Catherine's handling of a complex situation. By evening, we'd received word that the medical board had received my report about the fertility clinic. They were launching an immediate investigation. The clinic had already suspended my mother's volunteer privileges pending the outcome. It was a small victory, but significant. Daniela's baby needed another round of tests, standard procedure for newborns. While she was gone, I used the time to research our options. The restraining orders would help, but we needed a long-term plan. My mother would keep finding ways to interfere unless we made dramatic changes. The social worker returned with updates. The inspection report had been filed, but given the circumstances of my mother's arrest and the evidence of trafficking, Daniela's fitness as a mother was no longer in question. The baby would stay with her. The relief on Daniela's face when she heard the news was profound. That night, I made a difficult decision. We needed to disappear, at least temporarily. My mother had too many connections in our current city. Even from jail, she could make our lives miserable through proxies and legal harassment. We needed a fresh start. I began researching cities where I had professional contacts but no family connections. Places where my law degree would transfer easily, where Daniela could access medical care for her damaged body, where we could build new lives without constantly looking over our shoulders. Catherine brought news that my mother's bail had been revoked. The judge had taken the hospital incident seriously. She'd remain in custody until trial, but I knew that only bought us time. Her network of enablers was still active, still dangerous. The couple whose baby Daniela had just delivered made one last attempt to claim the child. They arrived with their lawyer, arguing that the contract was valid regardless of the circumstances. The hospital's legal team intervened, making it clear that any attempt to remove the baby would be considered kidnapping. I watched Daniela hold her daughter protectively, finally understanding what maternal instinct really meant. Not the twisted version our mother had forced on us, but the genuine desire to protect protect and nurture. She was breaking the cycle, choosing her child over compliance. My ovaries were healing faster than expected. The swelling had reduced significantly, and the pain was manageable with over-the-counter medication. The experimental substances had mostly cleared my system. Physically, I was recovering. Emotionally, the journey was just beginning. We started making concrete plans. I reached out to a former colleague who ran a women's legal clinic in a city 8 hours away. She had an opening for an attorney specializing in reproductive rights. The pay was modest, but the work was exactly what I'd trained for. The same city had excellent medical facilities where Daniela could receive treatment for her pregnancy-related injuries. There were support groups for trafficking survivors, resources for single mothers, and most importantly, no one who knew our family history. Catherine helped us prepare for discharge. She'd become more than a nurse to us. She was the first person in our lives who'd believed us without question. Her willingness to risk her career for strangers had restored some of my faith in humanity. The morning of our discharge arrived faster than expected. Catherine had pulled strings to expedite the process, knowing every extra day increased the risk of interference. She helped us gather our belongings while security maintained a protective presence. My laptop contained our entire case file, backed up in multiple locations. Daniela carried her daughter in a donated car seat, moving carefully to protect her still healing body. We had bus tickets to our new city, purchased under different names to avoid tracking. At the hospital entrance, Catherine hugged us goodbye. She'd risked everything to help strangers, and we'd never forget it. As our taxi pulled away from the hospital, I saw Patricia's car arriving in the parking lot. We'd left just in time. 8 hours later, we stepped off the bus in an unfamiliar city. Daniela's daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the journey she'd already survived. We had 2 suitcases, a diaper bag, and the chance to build something new. The women's shelter had a room ready. Tomorrow, I'd start work at the legal clinic. Daniela had her first doctor's appointment scheduled. We were finally free.